Hello and welcome to the Icons of St. George series. I'm Father Gregory. It is my honor to start this series and introduce to you the first icon in the series right here behind me. But before I do, I thought it would be nice to, as a way of introduction, to talk a little bit about icons, both historically and how we use them as tools in the Orthodox Church. So as we go through this series, we'll give one little factoid up front about icons in general to help educate you on our use of them and why we have them in the Orthodox Church, and then we'll go right into the icon itself. So I just wanted to first tell you a little bit about the history. If you remember, coming up the first Sunday of Great Lent, when we process the icons, when we give the icons to the children and they walk them around the church, that is the commemoration of the triumph of Orthodoxy, the time in the 8th and 9th centuries, 726 to 842 to be exact, in Constantinople, when icons were torn down and removed during what was called the iconoclastic period, because people were abusing the icons and almost worshiping them, peeling off, scraping the paint and eating the wood chips, because they thought that this must be God itself, the wood and the paint. So they were abusing the icons. So as a knee-jerk reaction to the abuse, they were torn down totally and painted over and totally removed. Well, after so many years, I mean, it was a 120-year period in Constantinople. After so many years, a lot of the theologians started coming and saying, wait a minute, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to remove them. We want to understand them correctly. And they wrote the big long proclamation that we will read on the first Sunday of Great Lent coming up. So from that proclamation, I'll just give you one of the many important uses of icons that they defended back then. And that is their tools for teaching. In the early church, Christianity was illegal. A great number of our saints that we're going to be talking about as we go around the church were killed in the first few centuries. So Christianity was not made legal. You could not legally be a Christian until 313 AD, when Constantine, St. Constantine, came up with the Edict of Milan in 313 that allowed Christians to practice their religion and their faith legally. So from 33, when Christ was crucified, all the way up to 313, it was illegal to be a Christian. So Christians would go underground into what they called the catacombs, into like underground caves, and secretly worship. But there were no printing presses back then. Books weren't abounding. The printing press came out in, I believe, 1450 from Johannes Gutenberg. So 1,000+ years later. So people were very illiterate, could not read. Bibles were mainly the Old Testament, because the New Testament hadn't been written, and they were written by hand, painstakingly in great big volumes, and they were not easy to be found. So when they were underground, they started painting the oral tradition on the walls of the catacombs, and they would paint to instruct and to teach biblical stories that were passed on orally. So here, if you were to see this painted on the wall, you would see a woman, you would see her next to a little baby inside a cave with animals next to the baby. And you would see 3 men on horses coming. You would see an angel talking to some shepherds with some animals. And all of a sudden you would go, that's the painting of the birth of Christ. That's the incarnation painting, because it tells the whole story of the Bible in pictorial form. So the very first thing I'd like you to know about icons, and the reason we put them on our wall, one of the reasons that came out of that proclamation, is because they are didactic. They are tools that teach us to remember at a glance Christ's life, his best friends, those who loved him and died for him, and his family, and we surround ourselves with those events. So the tools for teaching. Okay, now let's get right into our first icon. As you walk into the nave from the narthex where you light your candles, and you walk in, and if you were to look immediately to your left, you will see this icon of Saint Mark the Evangelist. And I've got some of my cheat sheet notes here. St. Mark the Evangelist, the word evangelist is literally the good proclamation, the one who proclaims the good news. And in the Orthodox Church, we know we have 4 evangelists: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that wrote the Gospels that we read from every Sunday. And here we have St. Mark the Evangelist. We remember St. Mark on April the 25th because, as Father Mike indicated in his introduction, in the Orthodox Church we are remembering the saints' birth into heaven, not their birth on earth. He wasn't born on earth on April 25th, but that was when he was killed for being a Christian, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Of the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew and John were apostles in Christ's inner circle. They were members of the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles. And then Mark and Luke were members of the 70. Christ took 70 other faithful men and sent them out 2 by 2 into villages all over the place, and Luke and Mark were of that group of apostles. So the apostles of the 70. So he does get the term apostle, but not because he was in the inner circle of the 12, but because he was in the 70 that Christ sent out. His full name was John Mark, so he's also known as John Mark, but St. Mark has the tradition of his house being the house with the upper room where the Passover meal was, the Last Supper took place, where after the crucifixion of Christ, the apostles hid and they were afraid, and then where Pentecost took place. It is said it was in his house in the upper room. Mark's Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark's Gospel is said to be the first Gospel that was written. Mark accompanied St. Peter on a lot of St. Peter's journey and wrote his Gospel somewhere around 70 AD. So Christ again was crucified in 33, and we have several years of no writing because everyone thought Christ was coming tomorrow. They thought the second coming was right away. But after so many years, they said, we better start writing this down. So they started writing down these accounts in order to leave these accounts wherever they were. And Mark wrote his gospel somewhere around the year 70. And scholars believe it to be the first gospel from which Luke and Matthew write theirs. They use Mark and write their own. And those 3 Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they agree on so many accounts. John is very separate. He's theological. He's totally different than the 3, than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So Mark is said to be the first Gospel. If you ever see some icons of St. Mark and you'll see a lion next to him, or if you ever look up into some churches and you see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they have little characters next to them, you'll see the lion always next to Mark. Because in the book of Ezekiel, there are these 4 characters, a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, that are understood by the fathers of the church to represent the 4 evangelists, the 4 Gospels. And the lion is given to St. Mark, and his Gospel starts out with the account of St. John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness, and the verb in the Greek, they don't use crying like weeping, they use the word roaring, like one roaring in the wilderness. So he gets the lion, and so you'll see a lion in his icons very often. And finally, where did he preach? Well, after he wrote his gospel in Rome, St. Peter ordained him bishop and sent him to North Africa, primarily to the region of Egypt. And after spreading the good news of Christ in northern Africa there, he ended up in Alexandria, where the pagans there were so upset of his success in converting people to Christians that they captured him, tied him up with a rope, and dragged him through the streets until he gave up his spirit. So, Saint Mark the Evangelist is the very first icon you see, and from there he will be our first saint, and from there we will go on and learn about the others. I hope.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Icons of St. George's. We hope to bring you an episode per week. May the good Lord continue to hold you and keep you dear. And remember, stay safe, stay strong. It's almost over. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.